is Mathieu, Mathieu Roche. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ID5. And ID5 is an identity company. It's a 3.5-year-old company now. And we're focused on solving the topic of today's discussion, which is identity for digital advertising. Maybe first off, to kind of backtrack a little bit, right? Identity is really what makes digital advertising interesting for brands, right? The reason why brands invest in digital channels, all digital channels, is because they can do things like targeting their audience, right? Addressing a message to a certain group of people, and not everybody who watches a TV show or reads a newspaper, as used to be the case in the old days. So targeting, they can optimize the frequency of distribution of their message, right? By knowing that you've already seen 2 ads, they can say, well, let's show them 1 more and that's it. And they can measure performance, right? That's what digital advertising enables them to do. That stands out from analog media or like traditional media. And those 3 capabilities are built on the ability to differentiate customers from each other, differentiate people from each other, right? Knowing that you have seen an ad or that your computer has been kind of exposed to an ad versus somebody else who has not, right? That's what this individualization is really what identity is about, to be able to differentiate people from each other so that you can address them differently and you can measure the performance of your actions towards them on a more granular basis. And that's why identity is so fundamental to digital advertising, and why the current challenges that identity is facing are such an important topic for the industry and the industry as a whole, right? Digital advertising as an industry is supported by identification capabilities. That's what we have to address today in terms of challenge. I think that the exact same dynamic motivates advertisers when they invest on CTV versus traditional linear TV, right? It's the ability to be more precise, more targeted, to kind of better measure, to count instead of estimate, right? Those differences are really important. And so the ability to identify users in a CTV environment, as well as in a mobile application environment, as well as in a web, right, in a browser environment, all of those really matters to the quality of the service a publisher can propose to a brand to engage with their audience. So I think it's a different context. It's a different technical problem, right? Obviously, web publishers have been using cookies, and cookies are on the way out. They're being kind of canceled by browsers, right? Mobile application developers have been using MAIDs, so IDFAs, right? Mobile ad IDs. Similar things are happening. In CTV, we're not there yet for a couple of reasons. One is, the dynamic of the space. There's a lot less dependency on Google and Apple in particular, and so that makes their decision less impactful, and also the space is a lot more fragmented in terms of identification, in terms of like the publisher landscape, right? And you have a lot of different environments. On the web, you basically have 3 browsers, right? And so whatever happened in one of those 3 browsers have a massive impact on users and publishers. In apps, you have 2 operating systems. So whatever happened in one of those 2 operating systems has a massive impact. In the connected TV world, you've got a number of platforms, you've got a lot of apps, right? And so the identity landscape is a lot more fragmented. And so I think we need to, it's both an opportunity and a challenge, right? That fragmentation kind of protects the space from any one decision that would have a massive impact on everything else. But at the same time, it's also a limit in terms of how brands can engage with the connected TV world, because they don't have this kind of standardized way of doing things that would certainly boost investments. So I think we're at a different pace or a different time on the transformation curve, if you wish, right? I have no doubt that identity is important for CTV as well as any other kind of digital advertising channel. It is probably less of a concern currently because you don't have the same type of headwinds that you have in other environments. But I have no doubt it will become a massive concern or a massive opportunity for the space to really increase its level of attractivity for advertising dollars. So again, I think it's earlier than in other environments, but if you look at the best practice and the approach that other universes, other channels are following, right? There's a few guiding principles. First, privacy is non-negotiable, right? The principles of entering into a relationship with a consumer, with a person, and being transparent about the type of information you're collecting about them, giving them control of that relationship, right? I think that's a very fundamental principle that all publishers, whatever the platform they publish on, should follow. So privacy is non-negotiable. First-party relationships are important, right? I think that's a second really important element. You need to get into a relationship with your customers, right? You don't want to outsource that to someone else. You don't want to be disintermediated in that process. You need to own that relationship, because this is what will create sustainability in the future around your ability to collect information about your customers, your ability to engage in that value exchange, right? Give them access to content and services for free in exchange for the possibility to monetize their attention time. So that's another kind of very strong, I think, guiding principle. And the third one is, it is a collective effort, right? Identity is not something that any one player can solve individually, right? It's a lot of people are saying it's like GDPR, right? We're all gonna become compliant at the 25th hour, and everything will be fine. I don't know if everything is fine in terms of GDPR compliance anyway, but it's very different, I think, because GDPR, you can become compliant on your own, right? You go through a process and you make yourself compliant, and that's it, right? Whatever your neighbors do isn't really relevant to your ability as a publisher, as a brand, as a technology provider to be compliant. Identity is a currency, right? You can decide to use a currency, but if nobody else uses it, it's useless, right? So that's why it has to be a collective transformation of the entire industry, right? We need to migrate from currencies that are obsolete, such as cookie-based IDs, such as MAIDs, into currencies that are privacy compliant and technically future-proof, right? And that takes time, because there's a huge network effect, right? And so I think, alongside privacy, alongside first-party publishers, CTV publishers need to think about the journey into kind of, future-proofing their identity strategy. And the earlier they start on that journey, the better, because again, we need this momentum, right? We need this collective effort, right? Sitting on this island and say, I'll join whenever something is ready, isn't going to work. Nothing is going to be ready until people use it. And I think the currency analogy is really important, right? It's like the value of a currency is directly related to its usage. And so using, testing, challenging, discussing, all of that is very, very important for CTV publishers as well as any other form of publishers, right? Because they have a role. They have a very, very important role, because again, they are the first party to the relationship with the people, and they can decide which currency works best for them, and as a result, they can influence the market in its adoption of those new currencies. Excellent. So my three advice would be: never compromise on privacy. Privacy is core to this new world that we're entering. You publishers are the first party to the relationship with people, and you need to own that relationship. And three, the sooner you get started on that journey, the better. I'd use a very kind of TV specific 3-letter acronym, GRPs, right? GRP is all about reach and frequency. Identity powers your ability to reach your audience, and it powers your ability to frequency cap your campaigns. So it is fundamental to branding campaigns because that's what drives that ability to deliver GRPs to the brand. And it's a very good question, because I think too often we say, identity is about targeting. Yes, it is, but it's not only about targeting. And I think when you talk to certain brands and to a lot of agencies, actually targeting is one part of the problem, but it's probably the least important one when you compare to control, frequency distribution, and performance measurement, right? Those 3 use cases, targeting, frequency capping, and attribution, are really the pillars of digital advertising, and they are the pillars that are built on an identity foundation. And restricting this to data, to audience targeting, to retargeting, to very sometimes DR-driven strategies is a big mistake. I wish publishers had been tackling with identity for years. I think one of the lessons to be had is that very few of them have kind of really, taken the bulls by the horn, if you wish, and really engaged with that problem before it became a problem, right? There's been a lot of things like, facilitating login with Google and Facebook, for instance, right? Which turns out to be one of the biggest mistakes publishers have made, because it's effectively handing over identification to their biggest competitors. Losing control, or not being kind of focused enough on maintaining control over usage of cookies on their pages, right? The old process of cookie matching has led publishers to have basically, hundreds of people collecting identification information on their sites, and very few of them have challenged that process, or have kind of put, principles in place to control it. So I think, and when they woke up, last year or this year, in some cases, they've realized it was too late. And I think the big lesson there is identity is fundamental to digital advertising, not just since 2020 or 2021, right? It has been fundamental for digital advertising for 15 years, right? That is what underpins Google and Facebook's ability to be, so efficient for brands, right? That's why they're gathering 50 or 60% of all ad dollars invested in digital, right? That's because of their ability to identify their customers over time, across platforms, across environments, right? And so, key advice to publishers, CTV publishers, who are probably kind of slightly less concerned by that problem now, because it's less of a problem, arguably, in CTV, is, anticipate. This is coming. This is going to be a problem very, very soon, because of technical and regulatory changes that will impact the CTV space, as well as it impacts the web and the mobile app space today. Key advice would be get on that early. Get on that topic early. Don't wait for someone to solve it for you, because if someone solves it for you, chances are it's in their best interest rather than yours, right? So educate yourself, know what the problem is, know what the solutions are, know what can help you, who can help you build a solution, or at least, start to design a solution, and get in early on that discussion. It's really interesting, because identity in the CTV world is not a person thing. It's a household thing. It's a group thing, right? It doesn't make it less sensitive. Doesn't make it less personal to some extent, but it is a slightly different take. And for all of the discussion about like people-based IDs, or like targeting individuals, with CTV, identity is about targeting families or targeting households, right? And that's a slightly different twist. Again, doesn't make it less critical, Doesn't make it less kind of, you know, privacy important, but technically it's very different. I think one of the shortcuts that the industry has taken to kind of address identity in CTV is using IP address, right? Which is you know, more stable than in most environment, because as you said, right, like your internet access is pretty static, and the IP address that delivers it is pretty static as well. So that's a pretty good unique identifier, stable over time. And it's interesting because, as you said, again, it connects different devices. I think it has definitely played a role. I think the main issue with this is that it is almost as widely available as cookie IDs, in the sense that you don't need permission to access it, right? You don't need, you've got very little control over who accesses it. As a user, it's very difficult to reset your IP address, right? So all those things make it actually I think this is the angle through which identity is going to become a challenge for CTV. It's the sensitivity of the IP address itself, right? And I think it's important for publishers to understand how they can anticipate those challenges. I mean, we already see things like IP rotation, or like proxification of traffic, or masking of the last kind of 3 digits of the IP address. So all of those things will become issues for the industry to work with, and I think it's really important to kind of look at it as an opportunity today, because again, it's quite an efficient way to identify households over time, but a potential area of risk in the future, and start thinking about how you can translate an IP address into a stable identifier that's consented to by the user, right? But it also helps you protect your assets, because again, the main issue with third-party cookies, right, is that it's an autonomous ID. As a third party, you're able to read your own cookie, and you're able to read the ID that sits on your own cookie, and to do whatever you want with that information later, right? That being autonomous in this is a real problem for publisher, because it means that anyone who has access to the page can do whatever they want with the data, right? So it's effectively like, you might try to close the door on data leakage, but if all your windows are open, it doesn't help much, right? And I think there's a risk that, and there's a lot of similarities with what IP addresses are and how they can be used. Again, in any kind of HTTP call, the IP address is passed to the receiver, right? So it's very similar to a third-party cookie being passed to the receiver of a request, without any control, or without much control from the publisher. So I think it's important to start to think about, how do you turn this into a consented, controlled identifier that can be passed only to the people you want to work with, right? And only when your customer, the end user, has accepted that trade-off, right? And so I think it's again, it's anticipatory a little bit, right? Like, it's not a problem for today. Most people will use IP addresses today to kind of understand who consumers are in CTV environments, but going forward, this is probably an area of risk that needs to be flagged and addressed by publishers in the CTV space. It's interesting because there's a bit of a double standard here, right? Like with apps in general, and CTV apps in particular, consent is kind of baked at the install, and with the install, and like you're basically good to go, right? While web publishers have to go through that process almost every single visit, right? And the best practices and the regulation really says that it has to be that deal, that value exchange, has to be repeated, right? Not necessarily every day or every page or whatever, but like on a regular basis. You need to kind of ensure that relationship is live effectively, right? You can't bury something that has happened like 3 years ago and say, no, remember, like 2015, I had you tick that box and we're good to go for the next like decade or what. So I think to some extent CTV is probably an easier place to collect consent from people, because of that kind of install, etc. It's probably also an easier place because the value exchange is arguably more stronger, right? It's a more engaging interaction to go and to kind of watch, you know, a piece of content and video, and you know, it's a family experience. So like, there's a bit more commitment than you know, just go and check like you know, I don't know, weather forecast or something that might be less, you know, engaging. But it doesn't mean that consent is less important, right? I think it still has to be very clear. And I think what we're missing, and what we've missed and what we're still missing on the web, is the notion of value exchange, right? That dialogue between the content provider, the service provider, and the user of that service. People aren't stupid. They know that ads is paying for the service they're accessing for free, right? But today it's an implicit relationship, right? Nobody says, hey, like, I've got journalists, right? I mean, if you go in The Guardian, right, The Guardian does a really good job at explaining that, right? They're saying they've got a panel at the bottom of the page saying, we've got journalists, right? We're paying them. And so we need to make money from advertising so that we can continue funding journalism and investigative content and all those things, right? And I think in most cases, outside of The Guardian, a few others, that trade-off, that value exchange is implicit. And I think it's in every publisher's best interest to make that valuation more explicit, because it reinforces that relationship. And if I were to kind of guess a number, I'd say 90+% of users will be happy with that value exchange when presented with this versus, well, you can also pay us for the content, or you can choose to, you know, get your news and get your content elsewhere. Like, if those are the three choices, because there really are the three choices, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. Going in without giving your consent, without sharing any data, without allowing effectively the publisher to monetize the time you spend on their content, that's not an option, right? That's the trade-off that some privacy advocates want us to believe, that, well, data isn't required for the digital kind of world to function. It is, because without data you don't have advertising, without advertising you don't have content and services for free, right? So like, again, you can't choose to go for free content and services without accepting the advertising trade-off. And so it's either advertising versus free content, or payment versus content. Like, there's no in between. And I think that value exchange, that discussion, has to be had in a much more transparent fashion. It's not dirty, right? Like, it's fine. That's how you get access to great content, great articles, great videos, great programs, without having to pay for it. And I think a lot of users will be happy with that trade-off if it's clearly presented to them, if it's clearly explained. And I think CTV publishers in general, but CTV publishers in particular, are in a really good position to have that discussion with their users. The future of identity in general, the future of identity in CTV, right? I think, well, the future for identity on the web and in apps is today, right? So that's we're living the future as we speak, right? There are announcements every week about things changing and innovations and, you know, initiatives and people adopting this and people adopting that. So I think the next kind of 6 to 12 months are going to be critical in how we shape the digital advertising market on the web and in apps. And it's only a short lead to kind of go from those universes to CTV. And so my expectations is that discussion around CTV have started, right? The fact that I'm here with you today is a proof of that. And they're just going to continue and increase in importance and increase in you know, in their reality. And our personal kind of time frame from a product and a kind of a go-to-market standpoint is, like, within the next 12 months, we'll have ID5 IDs available to CTV publishers and available to CTV buyers. You know, not as often or not as widely as we have today on the web or in apps, but that discussion will start, that rollout will start within the next 12 months for sure. Because again, identity is the fundamental, it's the foundation on top of which digital advertising is built for brands to be able to invest in a controlled, targeted, measurable manner. And this is true across every platform, including CTV. So we will have that discussion very soon, and I'm looking forward to have that discussion with you at Publica and with your CTV publishers.